Hello, everyone, and welcome to Trial Talk Live. I'm Julianne Labreche, and I'm your moderator for today. Waiting in the wings quietly is Judith Cox, another master gardener, and she's going to be receiving any questions that you might have at the end of today's talk. Just a reminder, too, that if you do have any questions, please just type them into the chat function of Zoom. We're always really happy to get your feedback, your comments, and your questions. I'm so pleased today to welcome our speaker, Rebecca Last. Rebecca is a master gardener, dare I say, extraordinaire, who hardly needs any introduction. She's so well known as a speaker around Ottawa and a speaker in the province as well. She's also a prolific garden writer. We're really lucky to have her today to talk about some quick tips to spruce up a tired garden. Over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Julianne, and welcome everybody to this edition of Trial Talk. Today, I'm going to be offering you some suggestions for things that you can do that are neither too expensive nor require a great deal of effort, and the tools that you will need to refresh your garden. So the strategies that I've listed here are organized very roughly in order of what I consider to be level of effort versus the return that you will get for doing them. And we're going to talk about mowing, edging, staking, deadheading, mulching, weeding, pruning, and adding a pop of color. This is one of my neighbor's gardens, and as you can see, they've taken the concept of no mow May well into June. This might have even been July. Now, to be fair, if you look closely, this lawn has a lot of rather pretty little wildflowers in it that I guess my neighbor was too tender-hearted to mow down. But the overall effect is kind of shaggy and unkempt looking. So mowing the lawn is a really simple, easy thing to do to make your whole garden look better kept and smarter. And the tools that you will need for that, now there's no endorsement here, I'm just showing illustrations of the different kinds of mowing tools that you might use. This is a push mower. This particular model comes from Lee Valley. The trick here is don't try and use it on wet or long grass, and make sure your blades are nice and sharp if you're using this kind of a mowing machine. You can also get the powered push mowers. This particular model from Craftsman, again, no particular endorsement for Craftsman. This is just for illustrative purposes. This is a gas mower, arguably a electric mower, and they come with either a power cord or the battery models. That would be, I think, a slightly more environmentally friendly model, and perhaps a little kinder to your neighbors because they're not quite as noisy or as smelly. In fact, there's a company called the Mean Green Machine that recently came out with a solar-assisted mower, but I wasn't able to get any pricing information. I think it's only available for commercial use, and I suspect it's a little on the costly side. Now, if you have a really big lawn, you might want to even go for something like this John Deere Ride-em mower. Again, no endorsement in particular of John Deere. This is just to illustrate the kind of thing that you might use if you had acres and acres of grass to mow. And look what a difference it makes when you do have a mowed lawn. This is a very nice, neatly trimmed lawn. You can see it's not actually a pristine green velvet monoculture like we might have seen back in the days of weed and feed. There's a fair few broadleaf weeds in there. I prefer to think of them as biodiversity, but just the fact that it's neatly trimmed does make the whole garden look better kept and sprucer than it would if it were shaggy. Your edging tools and strategies are going to vary depending on the style of edging that you have. Now, this is probably the easiest kind of edging in terms of making a flower bed. To maintain it, the trick is to make sure that the soil level in the bed is below the level of the roots of the lawn. So you want to go down 2 to 3 centimeters deeper, just at the edge of the bed. And of course, you can mound the soil up beyond that as you get into the bed itself. But by taking it down 2 or 3 centimeters, you're making sure that those roots of the lawn are not going to encroach into the bed itself. And you can use a simple flat bladed shovel like the one in the middle image here, or you can invest in a half moon edger. I've borrowed those tools from my neighbors. They're kind of single purpose tools, and I don't always find they're deep enough. So for my money, go with a simple shovel. Now, this is a different style of edging. This particular material is made of brick, but of course you can see all kinds of materials, from the little plastic interlock that you can get, boards, all sorts of things could be used to create this raised edge against the edge of the lawn. Now, just like you can never quite get the vacuum cleaner into the corners in your house, the lawnmower is not going to be able to trim right up to the edge of this border here. So what you're going to want to use is something like a weed whacker. That would be my preferred tool. I don't even know what model this particular one is, but again, they come in gas-powered, heavy-duty versions if you're kind of cutting down trees, or the simple battery-operated ones, which work just fine for most lawn purposes like this. If you want to go old school, you might choose a pair of garden shears like this, sort of like an overgrown pair of scissors. I find those are pretty tough on the wrists after a while, so my preferred tool here would be a weed whacker. Now, this is a really, really nice edging tool or edging style, because what you've got is a hard, well-defined edge to the flower beds, but it's flush with the lawn, so you can actually run the wheels of your lawnmower right up onto that edging, and no further edging is required. The lawnmower will do the trick for you. Something to keep in mind when you're making your next flower bed. This style here, on the other hand, looks absolutely gorgeous for about 5 minutes. And then you mow the lawn and you're going to get grass all through these pebbles. And you don't want to run the wheels of the lawnmower right up onto the pebbles for fear that some of them get stuck in the blades. They could damage the lawnmower, or even worse, they could get spit out by the lawnmower at high speed and hurt you or somebody standing nearby. If you're weeding this flower bed, of course, you're going to get dirt and plant debris into those rocks. And I think there's a reason I found this image on a site called The Garden Glove, because really your only option for cleaning this puppy out and making it look nice is a pair of garden gloves. As I say, looks great for about 5 minutes, not fun to maintain. So something to keep in mind the next time you're installing a new garden bed. Now, I'm a wildlife gardener, and my garden style is much closer to the image that you see on the right-hand side of this picture. The left-hand image is a much more conventional garden. In fact, this is a longer shot of that neatly mowed lawn that I showed you a few minutes ago. The image on the right could look very unkempt and like a bit of a jungle, but what saves it, I think, is that there's a nice, neatly mowed edge in front of it. And it just makes the whole garden look much more intentional. For those of you who are up on your gardening literature, you might have heard the term mullet gardening. All business up front, like the mowed edge, and a party in the back for the wildlife. And that is, in fact, what we're seeing here as an illustration of mullet gardening. Now, this is a picture from my own garden of one of my prize dahlias. It's a double specimen called Firebird. Gorgeous, big flower heads that are probably 8 to 10 centimeters across, or even bigger than that. It's not quite a dinner plate size. It's a tall plant. It's about 4 feet tall, 1.2, 1.3 meters roughly. And it's in a raised bed. So by staking it up, I've really allowed those flowers to shine. They're right in people's faces when they're coming into my back garden. And it really makes the whole thing much more impactful as a plant in the garden, a specimen plant in the garden. And of course, in a small garden like mine, Staking up your plants makes use of that vertical space so they're not flopping all over the place and taking up precious horizontal space. But I have to say, after a recent rainfall, I came out and I found this. All of my, well, not all, but a good number of my beautiful blooms had been knocked down by the rain. And there they are hanging upside down. Not a great look. So I got out a pair of scissors and I trimmed them off. And fortunately, some of them were in good shape still, so I was able to bring them into the house and make a nice little bouquet of them. And the result is that I have just the blooms that are standing upright, still looking really nice, not quite as many of them as I had before. The tools here, of course, I mentioned a pair of scissors for deadheading. You might want to use a pair of handheld pruners or secateurs if you're dealing with tougher plant material. Your stakes can be, well, I've seen hockey sticks used quite effectively as garden stakes. Old broom handles will work. You can repurpose all kinds of things for garden stakes. If you want to be a little classier, you can purchase some really nice garden art that's on stakes. Or the middle of the road option would be maybe to visit your local dollar store in the spring. You can buy lengths of bamboo. I've even been able to purchase those nice metal curly stakes that you use for staking up tomatoes at a dollar store a lot less expensively than you can get them elsewhere. Garden ties can also be purchased, but one of my favorite recycling tricks is to keep a bag of old torn pantyhose, and I cut off the legs, and they actually make super nice, soft, flexible garden ties. Now, this is from a company that actually does landscaping for professionally. And you can see here that they've got a really nicely maintained bed. No weeds in there. The plants are nicely separated, so you can appreciate each plant as its own specimen. But it's a little washed out looking. And look what happens when you add a dark mulch. Something like a nice organic pine needle mulch that you can purchase, or you can even use your own home compost to top dress, adding nutrients to the soil and also providing a dark background that really makes that plant material pop. And of course, it would be suppressing any little weeds that are left in the garden after you've done your cleanup. So mulching is a low effort strategy that really makes everything look just fresh and poppy and really brings the colors out and makes those plants stand out. Now, I have to say weeding is one of my least favorite activities in the garden. So I'm grateful to fellow master gardener Leanne Smith for providing this before image and also an after image. You can see that there is a border on the edge of this bed here, kind of flush with the lawn, but the lawn has sort of grown into it. Things are kind of all jumbled up together, and it's not that easy to see exactly what we're looking at. So some of the tools that we would use for weeding, I'm very fond of the claw myself. I think the official title is it's called a cultivator. Comes with a long handle, but being nearsighted and tender-hearted, I don't like to get rid of all of my little seedlings. I like to save and transplant some of them, so I tend to prefer the short-handled model. The long-handled model is helpful if you're in a veggie garden situation, for example. And of course, the kneeling pad to get down on your hands and knees with that short-handled claw does a lot to save your knees. It's not an expensive piece of equipment to add to your garden tool inventory. And I use garden gloves not only because my hands are kind of sensitive, but also because there are times when the claw's just not going to go deeply enough. You need to get your fingers and thumb around the root of that dandelion, for example, and dig that puppy right out of there with your fingers. A lot of gardeners swear by this Hori knife. It's a multi-purpose tool that can be used for cutting or digging, and this particular model actually has measurements on the blade so you can see how deep down you're digging, for example, if you were planting bulbs. And here we have our nice after image. You can see there's a lot more bare soil than there was before. The individual plants are better defined. We can see this stachys here nicely. And Leanne has done what I would do and left some baby stachys for next year. And look, there's a little sedum in there. I didn't even notice that before. Did you? it was kind of overgrown by weeds. So the fun thing about weeding is that you can often discover things that you didn't even know you had. And certainly the end result is a much better, neater looking garden where individual plants can be appreciated. Now, the one thing you don't want your visitors to feel like is that they need a machete to get into the garden. There is actually an entrance. This is my front garden here. I did say I was a wildlife gardener. And I probably left this pruning job a lot longer than I should have. So you can barely see the archway. You can hardly see the path to get into the garden. This little sign here, which is all overgrown, is actually my certificate from the Canadian Wildlife Federation to certify that, in fact, my garden has habitat status. It took me probably 2 or 3 hours to do a good solid pruning job and make this entryway usable again. And some of the tools I used, bypass pruners or secateurs like this pair here. Again, they're very much like a pair of scissors with 2 sharp blades, and they work really well if you're doing small pruning jobs or delicate pruning, such as the tips of an evergreen, where you don't ever want to cut into the hard wood because it's not going to regrow at that point. For slightly larger twigs, you can use an anvil pruner like this one. In this case, you've only got 1 sharp blade and it lands on a blunt-edged blade that's a bit like an anvil. I find this style works better if you have larger branches that you're dealing with. Larger again, branches or high up branches, a pair of long-handled loppers like this works really well. I know I can't think what the right term is, but this is actually a type of hinge where you can do 1 cut and then pull the handles apart and a second cut, and it actually exerts more pressure on the blades. So this is a good tool for cutting branches up to 4 or 5 centimeters in diameter. So you can get a pretty good sized branch with a pair of loppers like that. But then after that, you're going to have to pull out your pruning saw. And this is a simple Canadian Tire model. I've seen other models that come with sheaths or even that fold back on themselves to make them smaller if you have to store them in a small space. Some of the tools that you would need for your pruning job, and look at the difference after we've accomplished some pruning. So the ball cedar back here, I used the secateurs on that because I was really just trimming the tips, just taking it back enough so it wasn't encroaching on the path. This big shrub here is a Nanking cherry, and boy, did it get out of control. I had to use all of my pruning tools on that, including the saw, to hack my way through some branches that were, 6-7 centimeters in diameter. There's my certification sign. And look, you can see the archway, you can see the pathway, you can even get a glimpse of something beyond that at the end of the path. Really makes the visitors feel welcome and makes them feel like they want to walk up that path and explore the garden. And that, of course, is the effect that we want if we're inviting visitors over. And finally, I don't know about the rest of you, but I garden with perennials. And there's always a few times during the year, usually between seasons, at the end of the spring, when all my spring blooms are done and the summer blooms haven't quite started yet, where everything's really green. Or mid-August, I find, after the lilies are done, but before the fall asters and chrysanthemums and so forth have started to bloom. Again, I have a very green time. So I usually have 3 or 4 or half a dozen containers around the garden with annual plants that provide that little pop of color just to brighten things up when it's kind of a bit gloomy. And in this case, this is a very shady corner. It's kind of tucked in between 2 decks, mine and my neighbors. There's a barbecue here. It gets very, very little sun at all. But this colorful container of coleus, it's just foliage, but it's such a pretty pop of color with the bright chartreuse and the kind of rusty, bronzy color leaves of a different model or different variety of coleus. Requires very little maintenance other than watering through the year. And that pop of color has a secondary benefit because it draws the eye and it takes attention away from the garden hose, which is kind of hiding in behind there, and from the slightly rusted out base for a sun umbrella that we're not using at this point. So just to summarize, our strategies for tidying up our garden: mowing, edging, staking, deadheading, mulching, weeding, pruning, and adding a pop of color. And I would be delighted to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you very, very much, Rebecca. That was excellent. If you have a question, could you please write it in the chat? And as it stands now, we do have a question from Barbara, who'd like to know if you have any tips for sharpening your pruning tools.
Oh boy, that's a really good question, Barbara.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that I have heard about, and I have to confess, I'm not really good about sharpening my pruning tools, but for some of them, you can use what's it called? A whetstone. That's the term I was looking for, and sharpen them just as you would a kitchen knife. It's a little trickier to do because you're dealing with a curved blade, or in some cases, two curved blades. You can get them professionally sharpened. For other types of blades, for example, like the Hori knife that I showed you, I actually just use an old kitchen knife. One of the strategies I've heard about is to use a bucket of clean sand, pour a little bit of oil into that, and you simply push your tool into the sand. The sand will abrade the surface, and the oil will provide a little bit of lubricant to the blade as well. I see we also. So those are two suggestions.
Yeah, I'm assuming you saw the suggestion from Catherine about if you don't have any old pantyhose, to use some old t-shirts cut up instead. And that I thought was an excellent suggestion. I'm wondering, when you talk about staking, do you leave stakes in over the winter? Do you put them in first thing in the spring? When do you stake your plants?
Really good question, Judith. Thanks for asking that. I do have some ornamental stakes that I leave in all year round, particularly if they're near a perennial. So for example, with my peonies, I keep a tomato cage over the peony and I leave it there all year round. Those perennials are not going anywhere. There's no need to disturb the supports for them. It just stays in all winter. Now, for something like the dahlia, I actually want to get that stake in there before I've planted the bulbs, because as you know, they're going to have to be lifted for the winter.
Yeah.
And I don't want to plant my bulbs and, make sure they're at the right depth and they've been nicely fertilized and all that good stuff, and then put a garden stake in and drive it right through the middle of one of my tubers. That would be a really bad idea. So I put them in before I plant around them, backfill around them to make sure they're good and solid. And then when I'm taking the tubers out, of course, I would actually take the stake out first thing. It just makes it easier to lift those tubers. So my timing for staking really depends on what we're talking about, whether it's a perennial or an annual.
I've heard that some mulches actually aren't good for gardens. What kind of mulch is a good one for your garden? Is it always wood? Is it something else? What should we avoid with mulch?
Oh, that's another really good question. We could almost do a whole presentation on mulching.
Yeah, I
know. I think context is important here. The one thing that I would really urge people to stay away from is those nasty synthetic weed blankets. They just don't work.
Oh.
And boy, are they a pain in the butt to get rid of, because stuff grows over them, through them. You almost have to use a backhoe to get rid of them. They're not a good mulch material at all, in my opinion. A lot of mulches work really, really well. I do tend to prefer the organic ones. I think the issue is more one of where are you going to mulch rather than what you use. And there's actually an excellent guideline. I'm just trying to remember if it was, I think it was Brooklyn Bridge Park did a really good little guideline on where and what to mulch, because of course we know that there are soil dwelling organisms, there are ground nesting bees, and mulching on top of these critters can actually impede their life cycle. So yeah, that's actually something I'll look up and try and make it available through the introduction to this talk on YouTube. I can't remember if it was Susan Holm, who's a bee expert, or Rebecca Macon at Brooklyn Bridge Park, but one of the two of them produced this really useful guide on what to mulch and where to avoid mulching. And I think, again, for a wildlife-friendly garden that's going to be helpful to our native bees and other pollinators and other critters in the garden, one of your best mulches is a living mulch of low-growing native plants. So in a shady location, you might select something like Tiarella, for example, or Canadian ginger. I really like anemones, the Canadian anemone. They're a tad aggressive, but they'll grow in just about any kind of circumstances. Or in a sunny spot, you might want to opt for something like the native strawberry, the wild strawberry, which is not only a pretty little plant, but one that produces flowers and fruits. So what's to not like about that?
I noticed with your pop of color and everything that I really like that. But I was wondering, what do you think of using pots of, say, annuals or vegetables or things like that in the garden to maybe refresh it, to make it look a little jazzier?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, one of our master gardeners, Catherine Disley, who had the t-shirt suggestion, is an expert on container gardening. I use containers because I don't have enough room in my garden. Otherwise, I've got 9 or 10 varieties of heritage tomatoes growing in containers. And I can't say they actually enhance the look of the garden, but it does give me more growing space, which is my main objective. Definitely adding annuals. All of my houseplants come outside for a summer vacation. So for example, in a shady corner where I have a lot of greenery, I have a pot of the purple oxalis, which adds that pop of color. And it even gives me some flowers from time to time too.
We have time for maybe one more question, if anybody has one, to write in the chats. Otherwise, I believe we're just about finished. I don't see any more questions, Julianne.
Okay, well, thank you.
If you think of one, please write it down for the email chat line.
Thanks,
sorry,
Judith.
Go ahead.
Thanks, Judith. And a special thanks to you, Rebecca, for such an informative, such a practical talk. I know your own garden is absolutely beautiful and neat and tidy and a welcoming place for friends and family and visitors. So you're a good teacher. And so at this point, I'm going to thank the audience for listening in, and tune in next week. We'll be talking about renovating weedy patches in the garden. Bye.
Bye.